The History of the Old Brick Church podcast is brought to you by St. Luke's Historic Church and Museum, located in Smithfield, Virginia. As a museum and historic site, St. Luke's focuses on the development of religious freedom and the early American religious experience. This program was supported by a grant from Virginia Humanities.
I came across a situation that I shared with you earlier that happens during the Civil War. And the Civil War is really the overarching thing, too, with the Mormons, I think, too, is because the Mormons renounced enslaving people, which I think certainly had a political issue there, too, even though there might be some racial issues involved within that group. But chattel slavery was not one that they were wanting to participate in. And as we're having new states coming to the Union, whether they're going to be slave or free, that's a very hot button issue, I'm sure that absolutely is stacked against them as well. But in the Civil War, is a very kind of obscure thing happens, and it's when General Grant is in charge of the Western Theater. So we're talking about the territory between the Mississippi and the Tennessee rivers, and he's ensconced over in Vicksburg. And there's a smuggling ring going on that, ironically, his own father Jesse is involved in. But there are members of the Jewish community involved in it. And rather than him seeing that as simply a bunch of rogue individuals, he sees it as a group, and they must be expelled. And General Order Number 11 is issued in December of 1862. Talk about how a Jewish person would receive that, especially people coming from Russia or other places in Eastern Europe where the laws were very repressive.
I will. If it's okay, I'd actually like to go back to the point you made about the Mormons.
Yeah.
The Mormons did renounce slavery, but were, because of their situation, firmly supportive of states' rights. So in many ways, that put them in the camp with the Confederacy, which may be part of the reason why one aspect of the Civil War takes the federal forces all the way out to Colorado, right? I mean, Colorado, what are they doing, right? I mean,
that's right.
But, the federal government had to protect its western flank. And it's also why plural marriage or bigamy is not a federal offense until the southern states are out of Congress, because the southern states had blocked any declaration of bigamy being a federal offense because they wanted the Mormon support in terms of states' rights. Once there's no Southern representation or Confederate representation in Congress, you have the passage of the Morrill Act, not M-O-R-A-L, but M-O-R-R-I-L-L, a member of Congress,
right,
who also, by the way, gave us a land grant in colleges. It's the same guy. The Morrill Act made a federal offense of plural marriage. And that becomes the federal government's opportunity to really go after the Mormon church. So, the Mormons and the Confederacy, it's an interesting relationship.
Yeah.
Sort of, I'll scratch your back, you scratch mine. But going to General Order Number 11, it occurs during the Civil War. Most of the American Jewish population at that time was of Central and Western European and Southern European descent, of German descent, really. And that doesn't change much in terms of their reaction, except in terms of some logistics. The first major wave of Jewish migration to North America were Jews who are ethnically identified within the Jewish community as Sephardi. They are Jews who are often identified with Muslim Spain and then kicked out in the 1400s by Ferdinand and Isabella, but really are Jews who, across North Africa and into the Eastern Mediterranean and Southern Mediterranean, had developed a Mediterranean orientation, but also sort of an ocean-going orientation. When they come to this country, they come by way of Holland and the Dutch colony in what is now Brazil, And they leave Brazil when it becomes Portuguese, because the Portuguese had also kicked Jews out. And they come to the Caribbean and then New York, because it was Dutch. And so they could still, but the Jewish orientation, the orientation of the Sephardi was very Atlantic Rim. They were very involved on the Atlantic coast, in the Caribbean, into the Mediterranean, and by way of the Dutch, into the North Atlantic. So they stayed on the East Coast, by and large. The next major wave of Jews to come to North America were those from areas we today identify as Germany, right? It wasn't quite Germany yet, but they come to this country. They're much more familiar with a lot of the thinking, the continental thinking of Europe. And so they're engaged in basic capitalism, trade, and they move into the frontier. They follow the American expansion, and that's why there are Jews in the Tennessee Valley, the Department of Tennessee, or whatever it's called, in the 1860s. Like Frankfort, Kentucky, is a heavily German town, and so there are German Jews there, which is why in Cincinnati there's the oldest Jewish seminary in America. Mm-hmm. Most people would not think Jews, oh, well, that means Cincinnati. Right? But it's all part of this desire to come from poverty in Central Europe and make it in a capitalist system in the United States. So they're traders, and they spread out. And, synagogues are founded in the outer reaches of beyond by Jews who are merchants. But the worldview of these Jews is not that different from the worldview of Jews who come later from Eastern Europe, what is today Russia and the Eastern Bloc countries. And that is, we exist here entirely at the whim of our host. Jews have been kicked out of countries in Europe starting in the 1200s, kicked out of England, kicked out of Spain, kicked out of France, kicked out of Portugal, kicked out of Eastern European countries. The model goes back further to the biblical period, right? The conquest of the Jews by the Babylonians and the relocation of the Jewish world from what is today Israel to the Babylonian world, which, by the way, only lasted about 50 years in terms of removal. And then the Persians overwhelm the Babylonians and permit the Jews back to Israel. But nonetheless, in that realm, Jewish life thrives. But it waxes and wanes. And when the mood of the host turns ugly, Jews are killed or expelled. And this is a model that is replayed historically, but also built into Jewish theology. The Hebrew word is galut. Galut means exile. And Jews understand themselves physically in exile from, the Babylonian exile. But it also means exile from God, distance from God. Mm. And that distance will never be repaired until the Messianic age. And Jews, through the observance of Jewish ritual, can bring about the Messianic age by following the laws given to the Hebrews by God at Mount Sinai. But it just means that until that time, no place is really home. Politically, no one is going to accept the Jew. That's been the model for 1,800, 2,000, 2,500 years. But also theologically, we're not home until we're back in the land that God promised. Once Israel is founded as a nation, that brings challenges to Jewish theology, obviously. But the Jews felt they had a right to be in Tennessee. But I think we're not, if they knew their Jewish history and theology, we're not terribly surprised by what happened.